Title: The Yom Kippur War, a Nation on the Brink. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Israeli soldiers stationed along the Bar-Lev line in the Sinai Peninsula. It was October 6, 1973, the holiest day in Judaism, Yom Kippur. Across the country, streets were empty, synagogues were filled with prayers, and the military was at its lowest level of readiness. No one expected war. But war was coming. At precisely 2 p.m., a thunderous roar shattered the silence. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel's northern and southern borders. Hundreds of artillery shells rained down on Israeli positions, and thousands of enemy soldiers stormed across the Suez Canal and into the Golan Heights. Within hours, Israeli defenses were overwhelmed, retreating under the sheer force of the attack. It was a nightmare scenario, one that could lead to the destruction of Israel itself. Chapter 1: The Surprise Attack. In Cairo, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat stood in the war room, watching reports flood in. His strategy had worked. Israel, overconfident from its 1967 victory, had been caught completely off guard. Egyptian engineers had already dismantled the once impenetrable Israeli defenses along the Suez Canal using powerful water cannons. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers poured into the Sinai, reclaiming lost land. Meanwhile, in Damascus, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad ordered his elite armored divisions to press their attack in the Golan Heights. Israeli outposts, vastly outnumbered, radioed desperate calls for reinforcements. The situation was dire. Chapter 2: The Desperate Stand. As Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir received the horrifying news, she made an urgent call to Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. His face was pale. "We are facing destruction," he whispered. Panic swept through the Israeli government, but Meir refused to surrender. She immediately authorized the full mobilization of reserves. Within hours, tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers, many fasting for Yom Kippur, rushed from their homes and synagogues straight to the front lines. In the Golan Heights, a handful of Israeli tank crews faced over 1,400 Syrian tanks. The numerical disadvantage was staggering. Yet, somehow, the Israelis held their ground. Captain Zvika Greengold, a young tank commander, raced from battlefield to battlefield, personally destroying dozens of Syrian tanks with just a small force. His legendary stand became one of the most heroic moments in military history. Chapter 3: The Counteroffensive. By the fourth day, Israel had stabilized its northern front. In the Sinai, General Ariel Sharon devised a bold plan, one that could turn the tide of the war. Under the cover of darkness, Israeli forces launched a counterattack, crossing the Suez Canal and encircling the Egyptian Third Army. The hunter had become the hunted. Egypt's forces, once confident, now faced a disastrous defeat. Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger monitored the crisis. The Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union threatened to escalate as Moscow airlifted weapons to Egypt and Syria, while the U.S. rushed military aid to Israel. The world was on the brink of a nuclear confrontation. Chapter 4: The Turning Point. As Israeli forces pushed deeper into Syrian and Egyptian territory, a ceasefire resolution was finally brokered by the United Nations on October 25, 1973. Israel had survived, barely. The cost was staggering. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers were killed, and thousands more were wounded. For Egypt and Syria, the losses were even greater, but politically, Sadat had achieved a symbolic victory, paving the way for future peace negotiations. Chapter 5: The Legacy of War. The Yom Kippur War reshaped the Middle East forever. It shattered Israel's sense of invincibility, led to the eventual Camp David Accords, and proved that diplomacy, not just military might, was key to survival. It also changed global warfare, showing the power of intelligence failures, surprise attacks, and modern weaponry. As the sun set over Jerusalem, Israel mourned its dead, but stood stronger than ever. The war had tested the very fabric of its existence, and yet, through resilience and sacrifice, the nation had endured. If you like my video, like and subscribe my channel.